Hey there everyone, I'm back again with another video, and this is basically going to be my build guide slash showcase of my AFK Righteous Fire Chieftain. Please check below for any other timestamps regarding to the various segments of this build, and I'm just going to play a quick showcase of me fighting a whole bunch of bosses, doing a couple of maps, and then we'll get straight into the build guide.
We hope to build a home. We'll need resources and savvy planning. Soon we'll attract settlers, craftsmen, fortune seekers. It's not much yet, but with your help, we can erect the greatest city Raycast has ever seen. Our ships will be heavy with gold. Raycast is a cursed land. You'd have to be mad to settle here. And yet, welcome to King's March! It's not much yet, but with your help, we can erect the greatest city Raycast has ever seen. Our ships will be heavy with gold. Raycast is a cursed land. You'd have to be mad to settle here. And yet, welcome to King's March!
target. And there you have it. That's the showcase. As you can probably have told from watching said showcase, this is not a single target damage build. We are not built for beating bosses. It takes a while. You can get hung up on a single target and it can be quite obnoxious. You can go AFK and quite happily kill any of the regular default bosses as you saw in the showcase. However, when it comes to Ubers, there is the potential for being killed, or especially if Maven's there, you may have seen it, Maven's healing, you can kind of get really hung up on a single target and it can be quite monotonous. Now, obviously, unlike some builds, you have the option to just tab out and go do something else, but generally this is built for mapping and for Simulacrum. You can go into a Simulacrum, you can AFK it, you can basically press whatever you like. If you're doing ultimatum, you know, you don't have to think about what you're pressing. So long as you don't press ruin, you're pretty much good with ultimatum. And you can do like the juiciest maps going and not have to worry. There's only one map mod that essentially kills this build, and that's reduced recovery rate. Everything else you're pretty much free to do. Obviously, if you do a reflect map, you're going to have to want to take away the various things that can be reflected, like bladefall or bladefall volleys if it's physical reflect, or you want to get rid of the firestorm and pelting if it's elemental reflect, because obviously you will kill yourself. That is a possibility. But generally, just keep in mind the DPS is low because instead of having an active playstyle with a more rewarding higher level of damage output, we're essentially doing a playstyle with minimum effort and still the ability to maximum clear the hardest kind of juiced maps in the game. So just keep that in mind when you're going into this. If that's not something you want, there is the regular RF Chieftain, and it will utilize Flame Trap to deal enough single target damage to be particularly better at killing bosses than this. I still don't know how well that does with Ubers, if it's an Uber viable thing, but that is the path to greater single target damage. So before I get too into the build as a whole and what we're going to use, I just want to quickly cover how you're basically going to go about getting to the AFK Chieftain, because it's a matter of progression. You can't just jump straight into it unless you're already halfway through the league. So from a league starting perspective, what you're going to basically do is level normally. You're going to want Rolling Magma with Cremation, Holy Flame Totem, Flame Wall, and that will basically get you through the entirety of the game until a point where obviously you have the fire resistance necessary, the life regeneration necessary to basically be able to put Righteous Fire on. And I basically have to suggest at that point you follow Pox's guide for his Righteous Fire Chieftain. There will be a link in the description below about where to find that, and he will explain everything you need to learn there. If you're doing this halfway through the league and it's not a respec and you're just starting a new character, I personally like to use Poison Concoction with a few twink items for leveling. Poison Concoction can see you through the entire game. You don't have to worry about changing a weapon. You just have to keep your flasks up to date. And the skill itself, especially Poison Concoction of bouncing, is more than powerful enough to essentially carry you through the entirety of the game while you're just picking your traveling nodes and preparing yourself to have the AFK Chieftain build. But essentially, I would suggest following Pox's League Starter, because the main way you go about doing the AFK Chieftain is you'll want to get your regular Righteous Fire Chieftain set up first and then transition from that to this. This isn't something that you can just walk into, because there's a lot of stuff that you must have, and if you don't have it, it simply will not work. So, moving on to the equipment now, we will head into what is the mandatory uniques that I speak of. And this can be summed up into, there are 3 mandatory uniques required to make this gimmick work. There's also a couple that I would consider honorable mentions. I'd say another 3 honorable mentions that are kind of not quite mandatory, but they have varying degrees of usefulness. So starting off with the mandatory uniques here, the first one is going to be the Valerium Moonstone Ring, and you can see that on the screen now. It doesn't provide very much at all, apart from a little bit of fire resistance, but the important part of this is it gives stun threshold is based on energy shield instead of life. Now we're not going to have hardly any energy shield at all, which means that we're going to be constantly stunned. Now this is where the next mandatory unique comes in, and that is the immutable force crimson jewel. Now obviously you want it higher percent as you possibly can, because this will reduce the cooldown between your stuns, i.e. you will be staggering around the place less. So the higher the number, the less the impact of the stun will feel on your playstyle while you're playing. Obviously, if you're completely AFK, you probably don't need it to be that high, but I would recommend getting it as high as possible. That is what allows your stun to not feel so terrible, as well as to not last very long, which means that you can be stunned in rapid, quick succession. So the higher, the better. And then the third unique, you could argue that this third unique is not necessarily mandatory. You could probably live without it, but I don't understand why you possibly would. And again, you want the highest percent out of this possible, and this is the Blood Notch Crimson Jewel. This is between 40 to 60% of damage taken from stunning hits is recovered as life. If you're going to be being stunned with pretty much every single hit that hits you, you may as well be getting 40 to 60% of the damage that's dealt to you back as life. There's no reason not to. It's pretty much mandatory. You wouldn't necessarily be taking this whole cast when stunned gimmick if you didn't have the Blood Notch there. There's very little reason to go with the gimmick at all if you're not utilizing the Blood Notch. Alright, so as I mentioned, we have some honorable mentions here, which are a bunch of uniques that you probably will want to use, especially early on, but you can actually live without them. Whether or not you decide it's worth it is another thing. I drop one of these within my list, so I'm just going to put these out here in the order of usefulness that I would probably not replace them. And to start with is the Defiance and Destiny amulet. Now, obviously, it gives you some resistances and a little bit of life. You want to get a corrupted version of this wherever possible, because the increased mana regeneration rate does absolutely nothing for you. But as most people are aware, you want the gain 10 to 20% of missing unreserved life before being hit. What this essentially does is it gives you life a buffer based on how much life you are currently missing, and you know, that's a defensive layer all of its own. With life catalysts on this, it can go up to 24% of missing unreserved life. So generally, it's just an all-round very good amulet to have. But by taking this, you are opting out of the, the very end game +8, +4 level to gems amulets, and you're giving up the option to have recoup on amulet and stuff like that. So you can live without it, but I generally wouldn't recommend it because you're going to be hit so much, and when your life gets lower, you'll really start to feel the benefits of it, because we do have a lot of life and a lot of mitigation, and it just adds another defensive layer, which is really nice. The next one in this is the Cloak of Flame Scholar's Robe. Now it adds a massive amount of fire resistance, which as a chieftain we absolutely love. Increases the ignite duration on enemies, that's fantastic too. The fire reflect is whatever, but the main point about this chest piece is it makes 40% of physical damage taken as fire damage. Now because we have such good elemental mitigation due to being a chieftain with our 90% max res by the end, this is an incredibly strong defensive layer for a build that generally doesn't by default have very much physical or damage reduction in the form of armor. Now, very end late game, you can get rid of this and you can opt to get a rare chest piece with a bunch of different modifiers, but generally I feel like this is probably the best thing all round. And I don't take this off in mine, but you can. It's an option. You don't have to take it if you can find a better rare option that you can craft to specifically cover your needs. There's always the option there. Now, last but not least, I personally get rid of this in my build at the point that I'm at, and that is the Hateful Accuser Nameless Ring. Now, again, you probably want to get a corrupted version of this. It doesn't really matter. it doesn't give you anything good. It gives you mediocre amount of life and a mediocre amount of chaos resistance, nothing to write home about. The whole point of getting it is to grant level 20 penance mark. Now, level 20 penance mark helps substantially when you're a lower level because you don't deal the same kind of damage, therefore fights can linger, and you're more prone to being stuck in a one-on-one situation with a mob that's particularly tanky. And when that happens, you'll want to cast level 20 penance mark on it so that you spawn a bunch more of the same little mini versions of the boss, so that you get hit more, so that your cast when stunned effects trigger faster. Now, as you get a higher level, or when you get hold of Vow Breach, this becomes vastly less important because stuff will generally die very quickly, and it's essentially a dead ring. If you're not using the level 20 penance mark, it's a dead ring. And I find when I'm playing and I tab out, because obviously we're an AFK build and I'm sitting in a simulacrum, I don't want to be sitting there having to right-click Cosis in order to basically spawn loads of additional mobs so that I start counter-attacking faster. That defeats the entire purpose of it. So I actually get rid of this from my thing, but it is one of those uniques that some people will consider mandatory. I personally don't enjoy having that last one on the list. Alright, so before we get into the PoB and taking a look at my build in particular, I wanted to kind of give a list of important stats to get on your gear and equipment, and if need be on your tree, to make this build completely functional, because in the event that you don't have the ability to just transition over to what I have, it's kind of important to know what's actually useful or important and why. So I'm just going to go into that a little bit here. Number one on this list is going to be maximum fire res. Now this is because we're a chieftain. Our maximum fire res also counts for all our other elemental resistances, which means if we can hit 90% max fire res, we're going to want to do that because it's going to make all our other resistances 90%. Now, this can be very expensive or it can be more affordable depending on your gear. If you want to do it the expensive way, you're going to have it on all of your jewels. If you're going to do it the cheaper way, you're probably going to get the Phoenix Kite Shield, which adds plus 5% max fire res, and then you're basically going to go about trying to get it in different on the tree. Or alternatively, you can get it on jewels, but you know, jewel economy, it gets more expensive the more you try and put onto these jewels because of how difficult it can be to roll them. So to keep that in mind, you're going to want your max fire res however you can get it, and the reason being is so that you don't degen to death, because it will affect how much damage we actually end up taking from our own righteous fire. Next up is actually flat fire resistance. Again, this pertains to the fact that we are a chieftain, and our flat fire resistance also applies to all other elemental resistances at 50% of its value. This means that we get maximum value out of just stacking fire resistance to double what is required of our other elements, because it will fill all our elemental resistances once it gets high enough. Now I know what you're saying, that's great and all, but what's the point in overstacking one? Well, the reason for overstacking one is because we will also be taking the fire mastery. That means for every 1% of uncapped fire resistance is going to give us +1 for life regeneration, which means there's literally no downside to just being massively overcapped out of the wazoo on your fire resistance. So it's basically double dipping in benefits here. Thirdly, you're going to want your chaos resistance. Again, it should pretty much be mandatory, but for those that may not be aware, you're going to need your chaos resistance because you don't want to die to chaos degen, and degen is the most dangerous thing to this build generally because individual hits aren't really going to kill us. Of course, we shouldn't assist our dying by having literally no chaos res and chancing it, so chaos res is naturally going to be third on my list here. Now, fourth depends on if you are like me, because you can get this stat elsewhere, and that is increased life regeneration rate. Now, you can get it on a belt, and it's going to be increased life regeneration rate during flask effect, or you can get increased life regeneration rate on your gloves or your boots. Now, I use unique boots, and I don't have room for it on my belt, which means it's an incredibly important stat to get on my gloves. Again, why do we get this? It's to combat our own degen, as well as the degen we're going to be suffering from enemies, as well as just generally taking damage. So it's something that's quite important, and I don't generally think that you should go without it. Obviously, at a certain point, if you're in mirror tier gear and stuff like that, you can probably circumvent the need for it, but it's generally all around an amazingly good stat. Now, when we go into my fifth choice, it's going to be flat life and life percentage. Now, it should be pretty much a given that our increased life is going to increase our EHP, the amount of damage we can take, and because we're also using Righteous Fire, it's also going to affect our damage output. But more importantly than that, it's going to have interactions with some of the mandatory uniques and honorable mentions that I mentioned previously. That's going to help our defensive layers as well in a number of various ways. So there's like so many different ways in which flat life and life percentage actually helps us. We want as much HP as we possibly can, especially when you consider the fact that we're actually going to be using blood magic, and we're going to be reserving about 45% of our life. So you want to have around about 8k by the end of it to feel really comfortable, otherwise it starts getting a bit iffy. Out 6, my last but not least, is going to be socketed gems have 30% increased reservation efficiency. Now that's because you have to get this on your shield. There is no other way around it. And what this is going to do is it's going to save you 1 point on the tree. I know that doesn't sound particularly fantastic, but that point is going to add up when it comes to actually tightening your tree up right at the end. And what this allows us to do is basically, especially the way that I have this set up, is it means by the end of the time that I'm built, I am reserving 46% of my maximum life. Whereas, you know, if I didn't have this, it would be something like 70% of my max life. And it means that I literally sit on the threshold of being counted as low life due to a health mastery that we're taking, a life mastery. And it's just pretty much important for getting all of your auras and everything else in order, because without it, obviously, you're going to over reserve your life, and the less life you have, the more you're going to die. And when you get towards, you know, actually completing the tree and tighten it up, that one skill point is going to go a long way. Right, so when you go into the PoB, one of the first things you're going to notice is we actually have an incredibly high Righteous Fire dot. Now, a lot of these AFK kind of builds, they don't have that kind of level of Righteous Fire dot. Or if they do, it's because they're probably running mirror tier jewels, which have a combination of maximum fire res, maximum life, fire dot multi, and burning damage, which we don't actually have. We utilize, if I can just find one here, we tend to have the maximum fire res because that's pretty much mandatory, increased max life, and fire damage over time multiplier. In order to get burning damage on these jewels as well, you're probably looking at like 20 to 30 divine jewels, which makes them incredibly expensive. And I generally didn't want to pay that much, but if I did go out of my way to get that, you could expect the damage to absolutely balloon way higher than it is right now. But my main goal with some of the changes that I have made is designed to kind of get that same output as a regular Righteous Fire build, while also maintaining the near invulnerability of the AFK playstyle. And I've done that in a number of different ways. The first way, primarily, is we're actually using Malevolence. We're using Eternal Blessing Malevolence, and this is basically one of the first steps to putting out the same amount of damage that you would in a normal Righteous Fire build. I don't use Determination because I don't feel like it's actually overly fantastic. I don't feel like we need it, and I haven't really missed it ever since I took it off, and the damage increase has just been incredibly nice. And the increase of damage is one of the way that you're going to get around needing the Mark of Penance ring, because generally the only time you need the Mark of Penance ring is if your damage output is really low. So that's the first thing that I've done to kind of try and modify the damage of this to bring it back up to a regular Righteous Fire damage. The next thing is going to be the Annihilation's Approach boots. Now, you remember when I said that increased life regeneration rate was a really important stat to me? This is part of the reason why. If you want to actually improve your damage and add more defensive layer, you're going to want this. Now, this normally only appears on the kind of end game Righteous Fire builds, because obviously taking an additional 6,000 damage per second while flame touched, and we're always going to be flame touched, can be really kind of hard to juggle along with Righteous Fire. The benefits are just too good, right? Gain adrenaline, huge damage boost, huge defensive boost, and then we also have an increased movement speed boost because of adrenaline. It has 30% movement speed. Like, this kind of bridges the gap between that really slow and sluggish AFK playstyle with a fast, zippy mapper that allows you just to shoot all over the place. So this is really important, at least for me, in taking the AFK build to the next level. And as you can see, you can get pretty good corruptions on mine. I've got +1 endurance charges and increased life, and that's fantastic. And not only this, because we can't usually have, you know, most builds, if they want to get around being frozen, they'll get Soul of the Brine King. Obviously, we can't have that because it's going to interfere with our stun. And we need to be constantly being stunned. Now, these boots give us cannot be chilled, cannot be frozen, and they actually fix some of the weaknesses that are in this build, and that's its susceptibility to elemental ailments. So that's really good for, you know, mapping and just generally being in control of your character when you want to. And I mean, you don't have to. The idea is to be AFK, but, you know, there's very few times when you can just kind of be AFK. You need to actually be alive at your keyboard to be doing maps. Now, the next way I've increased this is with this helmet. Now, these helmets are incredibly expensive, but they're not the most expensive, because usually people make an Elder Shaper helmet that has trap things, because generally your regular Righteous Fire build will use Fire Trap for its single target DPS. And these helmets are generally how people have like 6, 7, 8 linked fire traps in their helmets. Now, I instead use this for my Righteous Fire, so I have like a 7 or 8 link Righteous Fire if you're going to count the +2 level of socketed skill gems. And, you know, level 20 burning, level 20 concentrated effect, 30% more elemental damage, along with +2 level of socketed skills. And obviously we're running Awakened Jewels in the helmet as well. Efficiency, Awakened increased area effect, Awakened elemental focus. Our Righteous Fire is on par, if not superior, to some, you know, regular Righteous Fire damage output because of the way that that works. And, you know, it doesn't interfere at all with the cast on stun, but it allows us, again, more mapping superiority. We can dart through mobs and they'll just explode on contact. And it just makes it more of a... It increases... it reduces the difficulty that we have with harder single target mobs, while also making us, or giving us, the option for the regular Righteous Fire playstyle, which is to zip around everywhere. Now, obviously, because we're using Defiance and Destiny, we're missing some of the bonus levels to skill gems, which is a large portion of the damage that we're kind of missing, which is unfortunate. But generally, everything else here is pretty solid in bridging that gap. Alright, one of the other things that you'll generally notice here is we also have this Watcher's Eye. Now, this is only doable because I've made the change to Malevolence, which is again further increasing our dot multi, which is increasing our ignite and burn damage. And as I said, and you'll see on the tree, we have a lot of these tattoos, 5% chance to ignite. And the reason we do that is because we need to maximize our ignite chance. The Dead and Ain't Dead of Scavenging, you can see its ignite is nearly 800k on its own. This is because, you know, the burn does big damage, and it does even more damage with the Kill Monster Explosion. If you happen to get a boss to explode or a rare monster to explode, it's always going to ignite because we have 100% ignite chance, and that is mostly where our non-Righteous Fire damage comes from. Because, like you can see down here, the Cast When Sun stuff is just doing tickle damage for the most part. Now, I didn't include this as mandatory, but I kind of consider it mandatory because it's just too good to put up. and it's the main source of us getting our endurance charges, and that is allocate's unflinching modifier with the forbidden flesh jewels. These are quite expensive, around 30 divines for the set. And here you can see 30% chance to gain an endurance charge when you're hit. Fantastic, we're always being hit. 25% chance that if you'd gain an endurance charge, you instead gain up to the maximum. Fantastic. Gain 1 endurance chance every second if you've been hit recently. We're always being hit. And +1 to max endurance charges. This means we have 7 endurance charges on this build, and we have them up pretty much permanently, pretty much all the time. Now, as far as the changes to the tree goes, you'll see that I've pruned stuff off of here, like 20% increased life mastery efficiency people tend to like to have, and I don't generally, I see the benefit of it, but my requirement for stats and the benefits I can get from a few more sockets just kind of outweigh the issue here. Like I deal with my stat deficiency by having a split personality, which is a point that, you know, I otherwise wouldn't have access to. Obviously, you can get this on the gear, but the higher end that you start to take this, the tighter and tighter the tree gets, the tighter and tighter the available slots on your gear. And it gets to a certain point where you kind of have to take this into the mirror territory. And I never really take it there. A lot of players never really get to that kind of point in the game. And I feel like I don't like making builds with mirrors in mind. It's the same reason why I haven't built this with a Mage Blood. The Mage Blood would completely redefine the way that you want to set this up. And I just don't like making builds around that kind of level of investment, right? A Mage Blood on top of all of this, it's just too expensive. I don't really enjoy sitting there farming for it. So this is the PoB. You can see all the stats down the side there. I have to recommend it. It's really good. It's a really solid build. Again, it's not a bossing build. It's not going to kill the Ubers. But, you know, so long as your maps don't have reflect or reduced regeneration rate, this build will practically clear everything without an issue. Oh yeah, I figured I should probably point out too, when the enemy does happen to go on low life, the DPS kind of goes a bit crazy. We end up with a 1.25 mil righteous fire DPS when the boss is below 50%. So that's also something to consider. Alright, so that is the build. That's the PoB. It's finished. We're done. No more Chieftain. No more. No more Chieftain. Right? So hopefully that helped kind of anybody who was thinking of doing this. It showed the progression. If you view my older videos, you'll kind of see where we were, where we started, and how we got to where we are now. I'm going to have all of the POBs of the regular RF Chieftain I had, this current finished version that I have. I'm also going to include links to Pox's stuff for the league starting and all of that stuff. And yeah, if you've got any questions, I'll try to answer them in the comments section. Hopefully this was helpful. I don't know if anyone wants to know about how I crafted my gear. I can go into that as well, or the currency farm that I'm doing. I may post videos on that. Do expect my PoE content to slow down. I'm not playing it as much as I did at League Start. Obviously, we're over a month in now, so, you know, energy levels are dropping on the PoE front. I still want to do my Warden, but I have no clue about what I'm going to do, so stay tuned maybe-ish for that. Hopefully something comes of it. And yeah, hopefully I see you in the next video. Thanks for watching.